Peace, peace. How's everybody doing? How you doing? Like you said, I'm Payne the Poet. In spaces like these, it makes me feel good to see that so many people have a heart to try to help, try to bring about change, try to bring anew. So what I do as an artist is I try to bridge the gap between the people that have the heart to help and the people in the circumstances that require that type of help and that could benefit from people like everyone in this room right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to breathe my life experiences and experiences dealing with this system that we're trying so hard to reform. So just vibe with me. Please don't judge us. No. You see, a lot of us were the victims of the ones that love us. Some of us had wayward fathers and undereducated mothers. I know dudes that hustled their cousins all dealing to brothers, but they were just victims of the ones that love them. Please, don't judge them. You see, many of them wanted acceptance. So as adolescents, they fell fast to familiar faults and foul perception. They thought drugs would get them paid, and they prayed that guns would protect them. See, a lot of them know no other life than the life lived by others before us, so we run in circles for any feeling of fortune while being mindlessly moved by the minor materials, mainly because as kids, we really feel it's important. I honestly remember feeling the drug dealer was supportive. He drove me to school. He bought me the Jordans. He taught me money over everything, thinking that the dollar was important, and we were conditioned to see that working the job's hard, but older dudes still got checks for unemployment, and no matter what, we never trusted any member of the law's enforcement. They never had anything for us. Only thing we've ever seen is them take family from us. No matter how much we try to tell him, he's just a victim of the ones that love him. No matter how hard we beg him to please, don't judge us. When you're raised in misfortune, you forced to walk a line that you were forced in. A mistake can land you in jail. The amount of bail to the family can mean fortune spent. It's unfortunate. They don't understand that this all started as babies, bottles and Pampers. Some were the sons of fathers is absent and followed examples. If she's the daughter of a mother with an abusive husband, she may not know what love is. It's a vicious cycle, and so many of us get caught in its clutches, and so many of us will soon have kids that are destined to suffer, and it hurts looking in the eyes of those kids that harsh destiny touches, staring at the back of a squad car when they arrest them and cuff them. Fresh out of frying pan into an oven, the heat on 400. We're raised in a fire that aids our destruction. We're raised in a war was all of us nothing. We're raised by mothers who always wanted marriage, but they never could trust it. You see, they were always victims of the ones that love them, but please, don't judge them. Don't call them products of the projects. We're far beyond that. A palm on my chest, my hand with my heart, and I swear we try. It's just that the reality of the world fed us is a lie, and the only way we can live is to fight for our lives in a cold, cold world. We've seen music and media raise our sons, and Jerry Springer and Maury have fathered our girls. And the judicial system, well, you see, they allow a judge to slam a gavel and say a verdict that takes a dad from a son just deciding he don't deserve, and it's wild. The court system purposely picks a person that picks out and points the fingers at people as if they're worthless. Beneath the surface, some pattern themselves as perfect, and I feel judges and prosecutors have been put in places that hurt us. At times, it seems they feel we're irrelevant. We've seen some offenders get a slap on the wrist, but a 17-year-old black kid in a clear case of self-defense get hit with the same time they hit Mandela with. To say we're treated equal, you're insulting my intelligence. Now, I apologize to my family for my incarceration. I spent 8 years gone, 8 years long, and I was wrong. I tried to explain that I succumbed to circumstances far beyond my knowledge's reach, resulting in my actions extending a distance further than my understanding could see. Back against the wall, suffocated under circumstances, and y'all, I needed money to eat. But thinking about it now leaves a sour taste in my mouth because making it out may have been more probable than previously perceived, but in moments of stress, reflex overpowers contemplation and situations deceive, so hindsight doesn't accurately express what I had momentarily believed. It was back against the wall, suffocated under circumstances, and y'all, I needed money to breathe. I'm just grateful that I had a family that loved me. I'm even more grateful that they prayed to a Lord above me in a world so ugly, and I just ask that y'all do the same. Please, don't judge me. Peace. Thank you.
Words without passion and meaning are meaningless. Thank you. Without further ado, here's our panel. Our former Supreme Court Prosecutor Paul Fishman. I'm saying it's former U.S. attorney. My apologies. Whatever.
Whatever.
Okay, Paul says whatever. Robin from the Bail Project, the director of the Bail Project. Mark, thank you, Georgetown professor. And Valentino, who's a formerly incarcerated man who was wrongfully convicted.
Are we on? I'm on. Mic check? All good?
All good.
So I wouldn't have said whatever, but I have 2 teenage boys, and that apparently is what you say no matter what happens, is whatever. So I'm Paul Fishman. I am now a partner at the law firm of Arnold and Porter in our New York and New Jersey offices. But for 7.5 years, I was the United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey, appointed by President Obama. My bosses were Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. And then in March of 2017, I was fired by the current president, which worked out fine for me in the end. And the reason I think I was asked to moderate this panel this morning is that for the 7.5 years that I was the United States Attorney in New Jersey, I and many of my colleagues around the country were very heavily involved in criminal justice reform in all sorts of different ways. Some on the front end, some on the back end. We're going to talk about the difference between those issues this morning. And I ended up working with lots of both nonprofit organizations and other people in government who were similarly interested. My particular focus in the end was on prisoner reentry, which I'll talk about in a minute. But let me introduce the panelists first. Robin, who is seated to my right, is the director of the Bail Project and a former executive director of the Bronx Public Defenders, which I won't say that's in front of my colleagues from other boroughs in Manhattan or other cities around the country, is the best defender program. I know we're on television, so please don't play that part of it. Professor Mark Howard is a professor at Georgetown who has done an enormous amount of both academic and, more importantly, practical work in prison reform and working with people who are incarcerated but innocent, and has done some remarkable work with students at Georgetown in both of those places, and he's got a great book that you probably should read. We're not selling it today, but you can buy it. And at the end is Valentino Dixon, who is here not just because he's the beneficiary of Mark's work and the work of Mark's colleagues. Valentino was incarcerated for some substantial period of time for a crime that he did not commit. And over his right shoulder, we'll talk about this a little bit too, and over my left shoulder are 2 examples of the art that Valentino explored while he was in prison, and that in many ways saved him. And so we'll talk about that too. But because this is the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, and because Melanie, who I'm desperately afraid of, has invited me to talk about the Jewish lens, let me start with that just for a second. But before I do that, how many people in the room are involved in organizations, formally involved in organizations that are working on criminal justice reform in any way? Okay. How many people in the room have, beyond those folks, have real familiarity with the criminal justice system and the way it works, either by virtue of your work in the system, because you're just an incredibly smart, well-educated person? Who actually feels like they know a lot about the criminal justice system? Because I want to know sort of what level we should be talking about some of these issues. Okay, that's very helpful. All right, so let me talk about this just for a second. So I was the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, which is the chief federal law enforcement officer in that district. I'm an emissary of the Department of Justice, although and report to the Attorney General of the United States. But I ran an office of 150 lawyers whose job mostly was to defend the United States in court and to represent the United States doing criminal investigations and prosecutions. And so it came as a surprise, I think, to some people in the community that people like me were getting very involved in criminal justice reform and as an aspect of our public service. In 2015, I was asked by a fellow congregant of mine named Miriam Chilton, who works at the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism in New York, if I would come to Orlando to the URJ's biennial and talk about whether there was a line, whether a straight line, a jagged line, a curvy line, between my involvement as a kid in high school in the Jersey Federation of Temple Youth in GIFTY and my own involvement in my synagogue when I was growing up, and whether there was a line between that and my then public service. And I hadn't thought about it in that way at all. And in truth, as I prepared to give that speech, I was wrestling with the ideas and trying to figure out what that line might be. Like every prosecutor and like Robin, who's a public defender, we have on our walls, particularly if we're Jewish, but even if we're not, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice, shalt thou pursue. We don't always look at it every day, but it's in the backs of our minds. Other people have quotes from Amos about mercy and justice and mighty streams. But I don't know that everybody thinks about it in that way. But as I prepared to give that speech, two things happened to me that were quite remarkable. The first was that the weekend before the speech, my older son celebrated his bar mitzvah, and his Torah portion was Vayera, which includes many very interesting stories, the birth and sacrifice of Isaac, but also the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which was the parsha that my son chose to talk about in his Devar Torah. And what he talked about was the fact that Abraham, when asked to go, when told by God that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, begs for the forgiveness of people he does not know. And my son's take on that was Abraham, being tested as a leader, chose to stand up for people who were, in fact, some of whom may have been wrongfully accused, some of whom would perish even though they were not guilty. And he thought that it was very important that that was part of Abraham's education before he became the leader of the Jewish people. Incidentally, in addition to that, as his bar mitzvah project, my son, I wanted to hear Valentino's take on this in a minute, his bar mitzvah project was teaching people in our federal prisoner reentry court in New Jersey how to use their cell phones and how to use tech, because as Valentino will tell you, when you're in the inside, they don't really touch those devices so much, at least not in certain prisons. In some prisons, you actually can get them, which is not so great. So, and then 2 days later, President Obama came to Newark to talk about prisoner reentry. And I got to spend an hour in a room with him and Senator Booker and somebody who had a background just like Valentino's. And those two things helped me figure out what it was in some ways about the principles of Judaism and our need to do better, our need to do more, our need to help others. That was a seminal moment for me. So I know that I'm putting Robin on the spot a little bit because this is not exactly where she thought I was going to go to begin with, but I would like to hear, to a certain extent, if you can, tell everybody a little bit about your work and the extent to which you believe what you're doing is informed by whatever Jewish upbringing you have or whatever Jewish principles sort of animate your emotional core.
When I decided to go to law school as a very young law student, I knew when I was going that I was going to go to do social justice work. It was never a question. And I had been raised in that tradition. I had been raised to think about justice and equality and equity, and more importantly, how when you don't speak up in the face of injustice, you are complicit. And so by the time I knew I was going to go to law school, I had already known that I was going to be doing social justice work. I wasn't sure it was going to be as a public defender, but I was committed to that as a young woman. When I became a public defender, I spent about 3 decades of my career as a public defender in various places in New York City. And I knew I wanted to defend people in the criminal legal system. I knew that if I was going to use this incredibly valuable, to say nothing of expensive degree that I was getting from law school, that I wanted to use it for good and for people that needed it, not for people in power. And so I decided to become a public defender, and that was driven in large measure by my work in a women's prison called Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, where I worked with women for about a year and heard their stories and listened to their perspectives on what the criminal justice system had done to them, to their children, to their families, to their communities. And it drove me to want to become a public defender. And I have to say that you can be a public defender for about 1 day and look around in the criminal court in New York City, but anywhere in this country, and recognize that what passes for justice in this country is a disgrace. You can be in a court for one day and look around at who's being targeted by the criminal legal system for, frankly, conduct that's going on in most communities, but only being policed in some communities, and those are low-income communities and particularly communities of color. You can be in the criminal legal system for just one day and see the type of inhumanity and degradation and humiliation that is heaped upon communities of color and low-income communities who are the accused in this system. And you have two choices. And one choice is you can quit and decide, I don't want to be any part of this, or you can do what I think my tradition drove me to do, which was you can stand up and fight back and try to make a difference. And that's what led me to being a public defender, to trying to redefine public defense through creating the Bronx Defenders, a sort of more holistic model of public defense, and then ultimately to founding the Bail Project last year.
Mark?
So I want to echo everything Robin said in terms of the assessment of the criminal justice system and the situation. Let me give my kind of personal journey, a quick summary of it. And in a way, there's a background that connects to Judaism. My father's Jewish, I'm half Jewish, and he was very active in the civil rights movement, as were many Jews of his day. He led a movement at Rice University to integrate it, which at the time it was all white, in Houston, Texas, and was threatened with expulsion from the university by the president, and kept on and persevered and succeeded in that movement, and later went on to be active in Students for Democratic Society and many other ventures. I heard those stories, and I was envious because I was growing up in an era, I'm born in '71, I was in college from '89 to '93. I didn't feel like there was a cause, at least it wasn't as visible, as clear to me as the civil rights movement was in my father's generation. But over time, and I will give you a little sense of what happened in between, but what I came to realize is that mass incarceration is my civil rights movement, is our civil rights movement. And I discovered this through some twists and turns. I actually didn't do it right away, didn't go to law school right away. I went on and got my PhD. I was a specialist in European politics. I became a professor at Georgetown, hired as a specialist who worked on France. I'm half French, Germany, Russia. I speak both of those languages. I lived a lot of time in those countries. I'm very passionate about the politics of various European countries. But I had a personal side story, a connection to a friend named Marty Tankleff, who's Jewish, by the way, who, when we were seniors in high school, we grew up together. We went to lovey-dovey preschool all the way through high school.
Was that really what it was called?
It was really called lovey-dovey.
Okay.
And on the first day of our senior year of high school, Marty's parents were brutally murdered. And by that evening, he was in handcuffs, accused of having killed his parents. And by the next summer, he was convicted and sentenced to 50 to life. And I believed Marty was innocent, and I wrote about it in our high school newspaper. I believed firmly that they'd made a mistake, but it was a time where there wasn't much known about wrongful conviction. There wasn't much hope for people once they were convicted. So we went our separate ways. We joke about it today. We say, Mark went to Yale, Marty went to jail. And then, about a decade later, I was well into my career, I reconnected with Marty. Something spoke to me. I reached out to him. We started writing letters. We started having phone calls. I started visiting him in prison. And I made him a promise that I would never give up fighting for him. I even made the crazy decision as a tenured full professor at Georgetown that I was going to go to law school to get Marty out of prison. There was a happy ending to his ordeal. Just before I started law school, Marty was exonerated. His conviction was overturned. He was released. He'd served almost 18 years in prison. It's a horror story, except that Marty has emerged intact and is doing extraordinary things. But to me, many people thought, oh, you don't need to go to law school anymore, Marty's out. But to me, my eyes had been opened to injustice through his case, and I couldn't close them again. And so I went on to law school and specialized in criminal law and founded at Georgetown the Prisons and Justice Initiative and started teaching in prisons. One thing you didn't mention, Paul, is I do a lot of work on exonerations, but I do even more work of education in prisons. And we have at Georgetown also a post-prison education program, the Pivot program for formerly incarcerated people. I'm deeply committed to everything that was expressed in that beautiful poem that Payne performed to us earlier. This is the embodiment of my life, and I think it's sort of the full circle with my father's original mission. And then I'm going to let Valentino tell his story because we have a close connection, of course, as well, and having the joy of seeing him out of prison as a free man.
Yes. My name is Valentino Dixon. I spent 27 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. And I was arrested on my mother's birthday. I was out at a public place, a gathering, and a shooting occurred. I ran to my car, drove away. I was pulled over and taken into questioning. Within days, 8 eyewitnesses cleared me of the crime, and the person that committed the crime came forth and confessed to the police. All of those witnesses and that person was disregarded. The police, they felt like it would be a public embarrassment to do the right thing. So I lingered in prison. I didn't have enough money to hire an attorney, so I was assigned a public defender. This public defender did not call any of the witnesses, did not introduce the confession to the jury, and I was given 39 years to life. After so many attempts of my appeals being denied, eventually I turned to drawing, which was my, childhood thing to do. So I started drawing, and knowing that the system would not acknowledge the evidence that cleared me, I says, maybe my drawing could help get me out of prison in some type of way. It was just a crazy thought, okay? Some years went by. I think I had about 10 years in, and the warden comes by my cell, and he says, "Hey, Valentino," they knew me as the artist. He said, "You think you can draw my favorite golf course?" I said, "All right, bring it in." He brought a small picture in of Augusta.
He didn't take you to Augusta to draw.
No, he just brought me a small picture in of the Augusta National 12 hole. That's a bigger version. I drew the golf course, thought it would be the end of it. A couple guys said, "Hey, you need to draw some more golf courses." I'm like, "Listen, I'm from the hood. I'm a black guy. I don't golf. Like, what are you talking about? Get out of here, All right, about a week later, I don't know, something went off inside my head. You know what? You've drawn everything that you can draw. Take a chance and draw some golf courses. Some guys brought me some old Golf Digest magazines. I started drawing the golf courses every day. Whenever I put my mind into something, I just go full court pressure straight ahead. So I'm drawing these golf courses. 6 months later, I think I've amassed maybe 70, 80 golf courses. I'm drawing them every day, 10 hours a day. So I decide to take 2 of the pictures and send them to the Golf Digest and write a little letter about my predicament. The writer, Matt Adler, he gets involved. He says he wants to come visit me. He ended up publishing a 4-page story in 2012. Then from there, the Golf Channel came on board and they did a documentary. However, I still lingered in prison for another 4 or 5 years before Marty and Mark got involved and got me out. I've been out 4 months and 22 days. All right. Now, even though my predicament or circumstance or tragedy is surrounded around the wrongful conviction, the evidence was clear. The witnesses cleared me, and they tested me to see if I fired a firearm, right after they arrested me. And they said, if you fired a gun, we're gonna know. Everything is gonna come back positive. They never revealed the results, but his students were able to get the DA in the case to get him to admit that, the results came back negative, but they never turned him over. Okay, and that was one of the main reasons why I was exonerated. Okay, but I'm here today because New York State has some of the most harsh sentencing excessive laws in the country. I have friends right now who were sentenced to 20 years to life, and they're have 40 years in right now, 45 years in, because the parole board refuses to release them even after these guys have rehabilitated themselves and have, acquired college degrees, et cetera, have done everything that they can possibly do to show that they've made progress in changing as a person. Another example, a guy, he's a 3-striker, so he commits 2 burglaries. New York State, he gets 50 years to life, for 2 burglaries. It's just so many different stories. I knew a guy named John McKenzie. He was 75 years old. The parole board denied him 10 times. He committed suicide. He couldn't take it no more. So I'm here to, in comparison to other countries, that we need to look at these sentencing guidelines and, and try to make them more reasonable instead of giving out death sentencing. Because I believe that, prison reform and sentencing reform goes ties in together, you know, and that's one of the main issues that we need to focus on. The reason why we have 2.5 million prisoners in American prisons is because people are doing too much time and nobody's being released.
Okay. So among the four of us, we've identified about 12 pressure points or issues in the criminal justice system that we could talk about for days. I'm going to identify just some of them, and then we're going to focus on the ones in which the folks here have some particular expertise, but I don't mean by doing that to exclude the others. So there's policing, an issue that I know actually very well because I led the investigation of the Newark Police Department, Newark, New Jersey, that led to the appointment of a monitor and a consent decree. But there's the policing issues. There's who gets prosecuted for what, which is a prosecutorial discretion at the state and federal levels. There's bail, which we're going to get to, which is Robin's particular but not exclusive expertise, and we'll talk about that. Then there's the one that Valentino identified, which is who do you get as your lawyer? And how do you get a lawyer? Whether there's even remotely enough money for public defenders of any stripe, and how adequately resourced they are. Then there's whether the trial system is fair or not. Then there's whether the sentencing is fair or not, and whether it's consistent or makes any sense. Then there's what happens when you're in prison and when you get out. And when you get out, not just by what chances you have, but how people in society treat you and what opportunities are or are not available and what the collateral consequences are of conviction. And that's just...
And don't forget the 5 million people who are under surveillance and supervision and parole in this country.
Exactly. So I mean, there's an array of issues, and there are problems at every level. Now, this is my perspective is this. I did that work for 22 of the 35 years I've been practicing law. So I know that there are people, I know a lot of people, of extraordinary talent, of good heart, with the right sense of mission and great judgment to do that work. And so by talking about these issues, I don't mean to suggest, and I don't even think my colleagues here suggest that there are not people like that throughout the criminal justice system, but there are problems in the system that we have to talk about. So I'm going to come to back to Robin in a second, but I want to key off something that Valentino said. And here's the question I have for you. And I said at the beginning, your art saved you, partly because you had the focus to do art 10 hours a day. Mm-hmm. But what about the guys you were with who didn't have art and get out without art, and people from Golf Digest magazine who have helped them? What's it like for those guys that you know who were in and are now out, and what opportunities they have and what they don't?
Well, I was extremely blessed, you know, not only to have the talent, but to have a family base that supported me, you know, and a lot of guys in here didn't have that. You know, I was a rare breed in prison. You know, a lot of guys didn't have any support base, you know, and because of it, you know, they didn't make the change, you know, that I made, okay? And then there were no real programs inside that would allow them to make the change. You know, I took my willpower to another level. Another person may need, you know, an educated person to be there to give them the skills or the guidance that, you know, that they need to survive, or even to get out and have re-entry programs and stuff like that, you know, that can help them reintegrate into society.
So Mark, that's a lot of your work. So why don't you talk about the things that you've been doing a little bit in detail, but more importantly, what do you, as a systemic issue, what do we as a society need to do for people on the inside, so when those people get out, and 95% of them are going to get out, 95% of people who are in prison are going to come out, they're going to be my neighbor or your neighbor or somebody's neighbor. They're going to need to help to reestablish themselves. The longer you're away, the harder it is. What do you got?
I mean, the answer is simple, even if it's very hard to implement. But it takes a mind shift for many people who don't think about these issues. But we need to turn prisons into productive sites of rehabilitation. We need to provide active programming, diverse programming, vocational training. We need to make prisons into places where people are learning and growing and evolving and transforming as people. And I know this because I've been doing it myself for the last 5 years, 2 or 3 days a week, teaching first in a maximum security prison in Maryland, now at the DC jail, where I go on multiple times a week. And I've been around people who, one, are extraordinary, even though they might have been 8th grade dropouts, they might not have read books until their 20s or 30s, but they discover something. That switch can come on. One of the things I tell my Georgetown students is that education and intelligence are two separate concepts. You have many people with low education who are very intelligent. And once they age out of that phase that so many people here, and I'm a parent, others are parents, know that particularly young boys go through, and that can last until 25 or even later, where they're making stupid choices, they're not thinking about cause and effect, they're acting with impulse control, they're influenced by peer pressure. But when you take people on the tail end or after that phase, you can turn them into productive citizens. I teach a group of people at the DC jail who are actually of all ages, and I tell you, they will not go back into a life of crime. They may get trapped by the probation and parole system that Rob mentioned, which is crucial because we have in our Pivot program right now, we have somebody who got arrested on the Metro. He's wearing a three-piece suit. He has this business idea for fashion for large men. He is really bright guy.
For small men?
That's already there. And he gets profiled. They think he has fare evasion. They look him up, and he didn't. He had his Metro card. We provide our fellows with Metro cards. They look him up. They see he had failure to appear for a warrant that was actually when he was incarcerated. And so due to that, now he's been in for 3 weeks. He's lost 3 weeks of all this productive time. This is just one example. I hear so many of these stories. There are so many traps and pitfalls for people. But if we set up a system where we say, okay, you have violated the laws of our society, you will be separated from our society. It'll be done in a humane way, right? That alone is a major change because prisons are such inhumane places of brutality. And we're going to create a productive environment. We're going to create an incentive structure so that you want to participate, you want to improve. This is what we've been doing. We have people trying to sneak into our classes at the DC jail. Now that's technically illegal conduct, but it's for a good reason. We have the director of the Department of Corrections telling us there's a complete cultural shift at the DC jail that's taking place right now, which is that people are talking about their classes, they're talking about their learning, they're talking about books. If they're complaining, it's not about the food anymore, it's about they need more dictionaries so that they can improve on their English writing assignments. So I think we need to turn prisons into schools. Now I know there's going to be pushback. People say, oh, they committed a crime, it shouldn't be a country club. I've heard all these arguments. But as you said, Paul, 95% of people are coming out. So do you want the person who's going to be your neighbor, your community member, to be somebody who's evolved, who's taking college classes, who's gotten a college degree, who's gotten some training, vocational training and so on? Or do you want the person who is for years and decades, and Valentina's right, it goes on for decades in this country, just put in a cage and poked in the eye?
So let me stop you for 1 second. So that's a policy issue, but I know that one of the goals of this conference is to give people things to do. So advocacy on that issue is one. But if you want to do something with a real practical effect, an immediate practical effect, talk to Mark, find out places where you can go and volunteer if you want to do that, if that moves you, because different things will move different people. If it moves you to help people like Valentino, who whether they get out because they didn't do it or they get out because they've aged out or they've gotten released, if you want to help people like that reintegrate into society, there are ways to do that everywhere in the country. Robin, two things I want to talk. First, I want to finish this, what I call the back end, what everybody calls the back end of the process first, because you alluded to the collateral consequences of both of supervision and disabilities that are applied to people like Valentino who come out. If they don't come out with a clean record, which is hard enough, but if they come out with having now actually been convicted, served their time, what does that look like for folks on the back end around the country?
So you can start actually at the front end. Collateral consequences of even a minor criminal arrest and conviction are enormous and have devastating lifelong consequences for folks. It may result in a permanent criminal record, which will prevent you from getting a job. You may lose your children. You may jeopardize your immigration status. You may be denied public housing. You may actually not be able to get federal financial aid to go to college, even for a minor misdemeanor conviction, no less, half your lifetime in prison with a felony conviction. So the collateral consequences are deep and they're wide, not just for the individual who's charged and has a conviction or goes to prison, but for children and community. I do want to sort of take the moment, though, to challenge us a little bit to think about, when we think about a criminal legal system that has grown over the past 30 years the way that it has, exponentially, and through a lens of punishment and isolation. And I just want to challenge you when you leave here today to try to reimagine what a system could look like that didn't even go through the lens of isolation and punishment. And I'm not sure the answer to that is to make prisons more humane or get more programs. I think the answer is actually we don't need prisons. We don't need all those jails or those prisons. We don't need to isolate and punish the way we do. What we need is to shift our lens entirely around how we see each other, and rather than isolate and punish, to shift our lens to what do you need and how can I help and what can we do? And how can we heal communities that have been devastated by this enormous apparatus that we built for several decades, rather than sort of tinker around the edges of, could we make this more humane? Could we make that more humane? Could we get softer handcuffs? Really, we have to get at the fundamental core, and at the fundamental core, at the rot of our criminal legal system, is structural racism and economic inequality, period. And until we grapple with that and shift our lens around that, we're probably going to tinker around the edges for far too long.
Right. So that's a widely, well, I mean, not as widely shared view as you would like, I'm sure, but we have to be careful, I think, not to shoot too far, right? Because if you do, there's a risk that you won't get enough done. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't also have the conversation that you're having, but let's talk about what you're doing on the bail side, because even though I know how fervently you believe what you just said, you can't stop doing the work of, and by the way, I wouldn't characterize what you're doing as tinkering.
No.
No, right? So the work that you're doing is enormously meaningful on bail reform. There's bail reform taking place in lots of places around the country. And just to put Valentino made the point too. There are more than 2 million people in prison in the United States. Fewer than 200,000 of those are in federal prison. So when we just had the First Step Act, which we can talk about a little bit, that was really the first major criminal justice reform passed by Congress in a very long time, it is accurately described as a first step. And by the way, look up the acronym. It's how they got to call it First Step is sort of a crazy acronym. It's better than the Patriot Act's acronym. But California has just passed bail reform. New Jersey has bail reform. What's going on around the country? What's good and what's bad?
All right, so let me try to put it in context so that you understand. So bail is, for those of you that don't know, does everyone know what bail is? Because okay, so I'm going to explain bail. So bail is a very old concept, and the theory was really simple. The theory was if you set cash bail, an amount of money, in the amount that somebody could pay, it was supposed to actually be affordable, that would create an incentive for people to come back to court so that they wouldn't flee. That was really the purpose of bail.
In fact, if you go back, I think, like 400 years, it was rich people putting up money to keep their family members home before they got prosecuted, basically, right?
Well, and low-income communities and communities of color have been trying to raise bail for their loved ones for as long as imprisonment and slavery have existed, right? So that's what bail was intended to do. Over a get tough on crime decades, bail became the lever that allowed huge numbers of people to come into the criminal legal system, forcing most people to plead guilty as the only way to get home who didn't have enough money to pay their bail. Right? So it has been completely distorted from what it was supposed to be. And what bail really does is, if you think about the economics involved, is it creates a two-tier system of justice. It means that two people charged with the identical offense, if you have enough money in your bank account, you can pay that amount and go home and fight your case from the street, where I promise you will get better results, right? You can work with your defender and your lawyers and get your witnesses. Or if you don't have enough money in your bank account, which is the overwhelming majority of people in our statewide criminal legal system, you will stay in a jail cell. And what that means is that you are 30% more likely to plead guilty, you are 4 times more likely to get a jail sentence, and if you're a black or brown, you are 2 times more likely to remain stuck in that jail cell without a conviction than your white counterparts. The thing that's important to remember about bail, right, is so 500,000 people every single night are sleeping in this country in jail cells because they don't have enough money to pay bail. And bail is put on somebody before they've been convicted of anything. So this entire portion of the criminal legal system, nobody's been convicted of anything, right? That's what this is the impact of. In our state system, 12 million people are churning through our local courts in this country and jails. On any given night, like I said, 500,000 people are sleeping in jail cells because they don't have enough money to pay their bail. But on an annual basis, we think it's about 2.5 million people who spend time in jail cells who haven't been convicted because they don't have enough money to pay bail. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do after being a public defender, to me it seemed this was a critical touch point, that if you could figure out a way to get people out of jail, held on bail early on, you know their life outcomes are better, the collateral consequences are reduced, case outcomes are going to be better, right? And families won't be destroyed, and they can actually be wrapped in the presumption of innocence, right? Rather, because actually the presumption of innocence is actually not supposed to only apply to you if you're white. It's supposed to apply to you regardless of your race or your background or your economic status in this country. So that's really where bail got my interest, right? The big question was, what if you used philanthropic dollars to pay somebody's bail? What would happen? Would people come back to court? So in 2007, my husband David, who was also a public defender, and I co-founded something called the Bronx Freedom Fund, and it was a tiny little experiment. And what we did was we got philanthropic dollars and started paying people's bail in the South Bronx who couldn't afford it. And honestly, we weren't sure what was going to happen, right? Would people come back to court? Wouldn't they come back to court? What was going to happen? And it was stunning to watch over a decade of collecting data that 95% of our clients came back for each and every court appearance, that over half the cases got dismissed once bail got paid. Think about that for a second. And that only a fraction of people were ever given a jail sentence, because once you're out, courts, prosecutors, judges will engage in community sentencing, right? Non-incarceratory sentences. So we began to see this is really critical, not just in terms of fairness, which obviously underlies the whole thing, not just in terms of thinking about everybody should be entitled to the same presumption of innocence, right? And everybody should have the same right to fight their case so that you don't have things like this happen, right? But that also you will avoid collateral consequences. You'll allow people to return to their homes, their children, their jobs, right? And preserve their lives and their stability. So we followed that for 10 years, and then last year we launched the Bail Project. We are a national effort with a national revolving bail fund. Our goal over the next 5 years is to pay bail with philanthropic dollars for people that can't afford it for over 100,000 people in 25 sites across America. We have 10 sites up and running already. Last year we bailed out about 4,000 low-income residents from across the country, and we are seeing the same thing happening. We are watching cases get dismissed. We are watching people get non-incarceratory sentences. And so that act, yes, it is not tinkering, but the idea of paying bail is disruptive in and of itself, right? Because it is the thing in the machine of the criminal justice system that no longer has a lever to coerce you to plead guilty so you can go home and kiss your kid goodnight. Right?
So let me ask you a question, sort of this following on what Mark said. If you're you and your husband, you can start a philanthropic organization to raise the money. Mm-hmm. Most people in the room are not going to do that. I'm sure you'd be grateful if they also contributed, but in the 25 sites that you've talked about, and I'm going to come back to bail reform itself in a minute, but what can people in this room or their friends, their colleagues, their neighbors do to work on that kind of project? Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of things you can do. So we're trying to marry direct services by paying bail with also then collecting the data to get involved in policy reform and long-term systemic change. You can get involved in that in any way possible. You can be involved in a court watch program in your community. Go to court, start a group, watch what judges do, watch what prosecutors do, hold them accountable for their action. Educate yourself about who you're electing to various offices in the criminal legal system. Most of us just vote down one line and we don't know who we're voting for, right? There are community bail funds across this country. Support them so that actually they can be paying bail for people. Educate yourselves, speak out, get involved. There's lots of different ways to do that. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. Bail reform is happening across the country for sure, but it's happening at a very, very slow pace. Right? And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe, really when you're thinking about envisioning a new system and what it should look like, and we do this a lot, we think about this as a Bail Project, what does it look like after cash bail? If you eradicated cash bail tomorrow, what should that system look like? And how do you have a system that's based on equity and fairness and humanity and community, right? And what should that look like? And that may take some time, but in the meantime, there are people sitting in jail cells and they have to get out. They can't wait while we're all working on systemic reform. Systemic reform in New Jersey Jersey certainly did take place. California, they passed SB 10. There were deep problems with the bill. That bill has been shelved, and actually California has now returned to its previous state, so bail reform is still very much a conversation there. It's a conversation in lots of local cities and jurisdictions around this country. Get involved in that. It's really, really important what we do around this issue, because it will drive lots and lots of things in the system and what happens to people who are ensnared in the criminal legal system.
Right. So, so just to follow on what Robin's, even the places in which there is comprehensive bail reform, the system wrestles with two questions. One is the one that Robin identified, which is the person likely to come back, right? That's the point of bail in its original form. They've been arrested. We want to make sure that they show up for their court dates. And to do that, judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, the people who interview them before that to find out what their financial circumstances are, do they have jobs, are all trying to make, sometimes it's just a back-of-the-envelope assessment about whether these people are likely to show up or not. And then the second is, and that we can talk about how difficult that assessment is. I mean, you or Mark can both talk about it, I suppose. And then the second question is, in the federal system, it's been this way since 1984. That's one question. The second question is whether the person poses a danger. Because it is possible that someone might come back, but still also might be somebody who might do something else. And as we all know from the headlines and from examples cited by all sorts of people, sometimes people who are out on bail do terrible things. And the system doesn't have a lot of tolerance for that, because nobody wants to be the judge who decided to let somebody out who then hurts somebody else, right? And that's the issue that the bail system has been struggling with for a long time. How do we deal with that, with those questions?
Yeah, I mean, that's the fear-based thinking that I think permeates the entire criminal justice system. So it's certainly there on the bail front. It's there on the parole front that Valentina was talking about. This is why parole commissions, and particularly when there's a governor involved, which happens in some states, are so afraid of letting someone out. It's always that what if. What if it's 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000? Well, that one might come back to haunt me.
We saw that in the Dukakis campaign, right?
Exactly.
Willie Horton, right?
Willie Horton, yeah. The ghost of Willie Horton haunts all of American judicial politics. I think that it's hard to overcome that. I think what needs to happen would be to depoliticize that. You know, in my research for my book, Unusually Cruel, I spent time in France meeting with judges there. Judges make decisions, and I got to sit in on some parole hearings. They call them conditional release, early release, where somebody after half of their sentence has the right to appear in front of their judge and explain what they've done and how they've changed, and then judges make determinations. And I talked to the judge afterwards, who let about half of them go and half not. And I said, what happens if one of those you let out goes out to commit another crime? Will that come back to you? And he said, no. That's a separate process. I'm insulated from that. In the US, it's hard to imagine that ever occurring, but I think that we need to take measures to insulate the judicial decision-making from this fear-based thinking. I mean, there's so much that drives it, of course, media and TV and the sort of hyper focus on crime, this obsession with crime that people have that just make the fear-based thinking dominate. But I think that we need to have a paradigm shift in how we go about it. I also just want to respond to a comment Robin made earlier. While I have certainly deep respect and admiration, and I share to some extent the view that we ideally shouldn't need prisons, I think that the reality is, of course, we have them in spades. While there's been some decrease, if we were to sit around waiting for them to go away or for our country to have this paradigm shift, we'd be waiting a long, long time. And so I'm committed to doing the work on the back end that Robin's doing on the front end, which is working with people so that they change and to help society recognize that they've changed and to open the door to let them out. I can't even tell you, I've written hundreds of parole letters. I've testified at hearings. I'm doing everything possible to try to get people out and to have society prepared to accept them, to welcome them, to embrace them, to support them. And I think that's critical, right? So it's certainly a dream that we share of no longer needing prisons at all, or at least in very minimal cases, but the reality is they're so vast and so prominent in the United States that we need to attenuate on front end and on back end and while people are there so that we have a more humane society, not just prisons.
Sure.
So, Valentina, I have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would like to appeal to Congress because I don't know anybody that I grew up with, you know, none of my childhood friends escaped prison. All of them at some time went to prison, whether it was a small offense or a serious offense, you know, and where I grew up at is a very violent, drug-infested neighborhood.
Where was that?
In Buffalo, New York. You know, chronic unemployment, economic collapse, there's no jobs visible, you know, so hopelessness, you know, and all of this, you know, people act out when they don't have anything or there's no hope, okay? And often this leads them to prison. You know, Martin Luther King said it best, you know, he said it takes money to stop the unemployment, the poverty, the bad schooling, to give people jobs. You know, you give people jobs, you will see a decline in criminal activity, you know. And people are people, and they're going to mess up and make bad decisions, you know. Also to speak to prosecutors and judges, you know, that, you know, all of us are human beings. But to have a disregard for a certain class of people or nationality or culture is not right. You know, that everybody deserves the same care and compassion, you know, that the next class receives. You know, so it's a human rights issue we spoke of. It's also a constitutional rights issue and a civil rights issue. You know, and I think that, you know, in comparison to other countries like Norway, you know, Norway has a recidivism rate of 77%. 20% compared to our 77%. You know, United States have a 77% recidivism rate. You know, and why? Because their, you know, prisoners are treated more humanely. Okay, it's better treatment, and they focus on rehabilitation.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question though. So, and then I'll come back to you. Okay. So, when I was the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, we started a federal prisoner reentry court for folks who were coming back to New Jersey, first in the Newark area, now we have one in Trenton and Camden, that they would show up to court every 2 weeks. They would meet with a judge, public defender, prosecutor, you from the U.S. Attorney's Office, probation officer, and the question the judge basically starts every session with is, you know, Mr. X or Ms. X, what do you need, right? And because everybody recognizes in the system that if you can't get a job, you're done, right? Because if you can't support yourself in some way, that's a problem. What the folks you know who were in, whether you know them from when they were in or whether you've met them since you got out, or your childhood friends you were talking about, what are the things that the system can do? Because you're right, Congress could act, but let's not hold out our hopes for that at the moment. Maybe the government won't even be open on Friday. So the question for you is what does a program look like for a guy who comes out in your situation, not having done it at all, or having served his time and served it in a relatively productive way, whether it's drawing or not? What does that look like?
Well, first of all, there's thousands of obstacles for a felon coming out of prison. And the guy wrote a book that there were 10,000 obstacles, but I don't believe it's that many. I will narrow it down to maybe just a couple hundred. Let's just be reasonable.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just be reasonable. It's a few hundred obstacles, you know, and I knew this while I was in, because I paid attention to the guys that were coming back, and I would ask them, hey, why you left a couple years ago, now you're back, what's the reason? You know, and it was always based on there's no jobs, you know, and the jobs that are available, the guy can't survive off of $250 a week. You know, it's just not going to pay anything. So what does he do? He resorts back to his old ways, and he says, you know, I might have to get it this way. I may have to knock somebody upside the head to, you know, to get my next meal. And there's always,
and there are often guys who they used to run with who are welcoming them back in a way that we don't.
Right. You know, and so that's the core of the problem of mass incarceration is there's a lack of jobs. You know, training also. You know, people need to be trained, you know, educated, you know, and for example, when I was arrested in 91, I went to Attica in 92, you know, and I enrolled in college for small business. The following year, Governor Pataki took it, you know, so I had to resort to just ordering books and reading on self-help books, You know, so it's a lot of guys that if they can given the opportunity would go to college inside prison. And this would change their mentality tremendously.
Robert, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I did. So, you know, over the past 25 years, 99% of our jail growth in this country has been specifically and exclusively because of bail. So 99% of our jail growth has been the result of holding people in jail cells who haven't been convicted of crimes because they can't pay bail.
Sorry, when you say jail as opposed to prisons.
Correct. Yeah. So but think about that for a second. It costs us annually as a society, right, $14 billion a year to hold people in jail cells who haven't been convicted of a crime on cash bail. So when we talk about education and reinvesting in communities and healing communities, right, that need to be healed, people always go, well, we don't have the money to do that. And I want to say, well, you could take the $14 billion that you're using to hold people in jail cells who haven't been convicted of crimes, and you can reinvest those into communities and allow communities to decide how to heal themselves and what that looks like. So that's, I think, a really sort of a perfect point, but also that the money is actually there, we're just spending it in different ways.
Right. I'm going to tell one quick story, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions. For the 12 years before I was the United States Attorney, I spent 14 years with the Department of Justice, then I spent 12 years in private practice, and then I was the U.S. Attorney for 7.5 before I came back into private practice. And so in that 12 years, I had clients who were prosecuted, I had clients who were acquitted, I had clients who were convicted, I had clients who went to jail. I had a client who I've introduced to Melanie and other folks at JCPA, who's an Orthodox Jew who was convicted of tax evasion. And because this is the way the federal prison system does it, they send people farther away because there aren't federal prisons everywhere. And they often try to separate people sometimes from the folks with whom they were running before, sometimes from other defendants with whom they've been convicted. My client was in Petersburg, West Virginia, in a level 1 facility. And because he was a man of means, his family, he had a wife and 5 kids, would come to visit him with great frequency. And his wife would be sitting in the waiting area, talking to the other wives. And she would say, what's your husband here for? Oh, he was convicted of X or Y or Z, often drug dealing or some offense like that. And she would say, well, when was the last time you were here to see him? And she would say, I've never been here. And she would say, well, why haven't you been here? And he said, well, I live in upstate New York. I have 3 kids and 2 jobs. It's a long way from home. It's hard to get here. It's expensive. And so what happens to that family? Because the people are far away, right? My client, when he came home, after only 2 years in prison, came home to a wife and 5 kids in New Jersey in a really nice house. And he had real family connections and means to actually resume a relatively normal life. Although even for him, American Express canceled his card. That's not a big deal in some ways, and compared to what other people go through. But think, if a guy like that can't get an American Express card, like how is somebody like Valentino supposed to get access to banking so that he can actually just open a checking account, right? And the way the system works, that it becomes really hard just to engage in the basic necessities of life. The upshot is, the thing that was nice about it is that my former client heard about my reentry court, and he now comes every 2 weeks. He's a Orthodox Jewish guy in his 50s who has made a connection with the people who are in the prison reentry court because he understands the minimal obstacles that he faces and what it's like for people who don't look like him and come from his background. So anyway, but I'd like to hear some questions, although Robin looks like she's about to say something.
I just want to address one thing, because I'm afraid everybody's going to leave this room and then get caught in the same trap we always get caught in, which is the narrative of fear and public safety. Right? So what everybody always talks about is, what about the person who's charged with the terrible, scary thing? And there are people sometimes charged with terrible, scary things. And you know, number one, remember that's an accusation, not a conviction, right? And that's a really important distinction that we often forget. But number two, do we legislate around the exceptions? Right? Think about how we think about this problem, right? And this constant sort of law and order, and I say law and order like the television show, which in my opinion did more harm to this country and criminal justice than anything else on television, but, and yeah, I'll call that out. But to really think carefully about, in any other area, do we legislate around the exception? If 4,000 people got bailed out in the Bail Project last year and 2 people are charged with committing a crime that involved violence, do we stop doing the work? Do we legislate around the exception, or do we hold on to our principles and our values and say sometimes it's not going to go right, but most of the time, with release to community and supports, it will, right? And to hold on to that, because it's really, really important. And the second point about public safety, and this, you're right, is going to drive me crazy. We talk about public safety, right, as if those 12 million people being shoveled through our system are not part of the public. We talk about risk, right, as if the 12 million people coming from low-income communities and communities of color in this country are not at risk from the experience of being put in jail cells and held in prison. The data is 100% clear, right, 100% clear. Spending time in jail makes you more likely to commit another crime when you come out than if you had been free all along. So when people start talking about risk and public safety, that has to include everybody, including not just the 12 million people being shoveled in the system, their families, their children, and their communities, and the risk to them. So if you're talking about risk assessment tools, you want to have a risk assessment tool over here that says, what's the risk to the person who's the accused and is in the system? What's the risk to his or her children? What's the risk to his or her family and mother and employers and community? And so when we're talking about risk and public safety, really, really hold on to your hats, right? And stay grounded in the principles that we really believe in and should believe in as a community, right? Which is equal justice under the law, the presumption of innocence, and humanity, right? Not isolation and punishment. What do you need and what can we do?
In the front row. Yep.
Thank you. So please ask a question. You have roughly about 45 seconds. A question, please. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, questions, not state. Right, exactly.
That's right. I'm Jessica Cohen. I'm the CRC director in Cleveland, and we are working on bail reform. I'm very passionate about this. We've also been glued to the Serial podcast, which the third season featured our city. And one of the things that we've heard through this podcast is about the decision to charge, period, to actually charge, and what that does for people who are innocent. And so my question is, you know, what levers around the district attorney's office or local policy or the AUSAs and things like that what is possible there? Because often that decision to charge sets off that chain reaction that's very harmful for folks. Mm-hmm.
You want to ask it for
I mean, that's really for you, but
I mean, you're right that.
Handoff. Right.
I mean, look, the system has complete power imbalance, right? And the power really is out of whack and sits in the hands of probably the prosecutors more than anybody else. And that is what mandatory sentencing did and empowered them to make those decisions, and charging decisions are theirs exclusively. They need to be held accountable also. There are people around the country who are doing good reform work around prosecutorial accountability. Get involved in that, learn about that, support them, beginning to change the paradigm of what does it mean to be a prosecutor and what does it mean to seek justice. And that doesn't just mean convictions, right? That means something much bigger. So you're quite right that the power imbalance really does rest with prosecutors in large measure, and there needs to be a lot of accountability there.
Right. So, having been a prosecutor for more than 2 decades, so there are differences. I was in the federal system. The federal system and the state system, very different in this regard. In a U.S. attorney's office, where I worked for most of that time, before someone gets charged, it's generally a situation in which there has been a relatively long-term, in-depth investigation. And I'll use the Mueller investigation as an example since everybody's paying attention to that. Grand jury is impaneled. FBI agents and IRS agents are out looking at records and interviewing witnesses. By the time that case gets to a place where a charging decision has to be made, there's lots of stuff that's gone on. I'm not saying that mistakes don't happen in that system, but there's often an opportunity for defense lawyers to come in and argue their client's case to the prosecutor before. There's a give and take. It's a decision that it can be made correctly or incorrectly, but it's made in a much more deliberative fashion. What happens in cases, and in some sense Valentino's is an example of that. A shooting occurs outside. The cops respond. Two guys get into a fight outside of a bar. The cops respond. Somebody robs a bank. The cops respond. and somebody gets arrested based on whatever information the cops are able to gather at that moment. They can't spend a week or two investigating if they have potential subjects right there, because people might not hang around. And so often the police have to make a decision. That case then gets presented to a prosecutor in an incomplete fashion, with certain amounts of evidence that have been collected, other amounts of evidence that have not been collected. And so the process takes place in a cauldron in some ways, where decisions get made. I think what has to happen in that circumstance, and it doesn't happen in a system that's overburdened, with defense lawyers who aren't getting paid enough, and not enough public defenders to begin with. And I recommend that you go watch a documentary that's on HBO, I don't know if it's still there, called Gideon's Army. Clarence Gideon, of course, was the person who litigated all the way to the Supreme Court on whether he should have the constitutional right to counsel. The case was litigated in the mid-1960s. It was actually handled by what is now my law firm, Arnold and Porter, but I wasn't there then. I was in kindergarten. But Gideon's Army is a documentary about 3 public defenders, assistant public defenders in the South, and the resources that they have to deal with those circumstances. The idea that people like that have enough bandwidth to have meaningful conversations with prosecutors at the charging stage is not right. And so one issue in the system that we haven't really talked about today is how do we adequately resource and fund defense lawyers throughout that part of the proceeding. I'm not apologizing for the charging decisions that get made. Some of them are wrong and some of them are bad. But the system in which it takes place is complicated and hard sometimes. And then there are incentives in particular places for prosecutors to charge in certain ways. The system gives those incentives. There is a political overlay to that too. It's not just the one guy who comes out. It's whether lots of district attorneys are elected, and people will say they weren't hard enough on people. That's the way politics runs sometimes. So changing the paradigm shift, doing a paradigm shift in the way you were talking, often we'll have to have a conversation about what it really means to have strong law enforcement at the prosecutorial level.
But state systems are overburdened because we decided to criminalize race, poverty, drug addiction, homelessness, right, immigration. Like, the system's overloaded because the decisions we've made about who and what we're criminalizing. You could decriminalize those things. You could look at drugs alone through a public health lens, and frankly, you could probably close half the jails in this country, right? If you thought about it that way, the systems wouldn't be so overloaded, and there would be plenty of resources to make sure that people charged with crimes that we decide as a society need to be prosecuted have actual lawyers.
Let me just add a couple distinctions on prosecutors. So one, just to reiterate and make clear the point Paul made in passing, but 90% of crimes are prosecuted at the state level. Right, so I think there's this public fascination with Congress, with what's happening on a federal level, with Mueller investigation, of course, but that's not where criminal justice in America takes place. We have 51 different systems of criminal justice in this country. The federal level is one of those 51, right? It's at the state level where all the action takes place. And there's a lot of variety in terms of how it's handled. But I think the one common factor in all of them is that even though there's this myth, and Law & Order reinforces this every day, and it's so damaging, and I tell my students, do not watch Law & Order. Or if you do, if you take my course, you will never enjoy Law & Order again, because you're going to see how poisonous it is. But it has this myth of this adversarial system where you have equal sides that are fighting, and the force of good is for the state, and then the trying to defend the bad people is the defense, that somehow they go to trial, which of course only 5% of cases even go to trial. They all happen in a plea bargaining process that's all controlled by the prosecutor. And then there's this myth of the judge who's the calling balls and strikes and the neutral arbiter and so on. The reality is that justice happens in the prosecutor's office. And while it's certainly possible to be an ethical prosecutor, all of the incentives are pushing in the other direction. They're pushing towards convictions, towards longer time, and towards denying adequate defense, denying information that's beneficial to the defense. That's happened in Valentino's case. I mean, we discovered, our students, 3 21-year-old students, caught a veteran seasoned prosecutor on camera when they were interviewing him, admitting to something he had done 27 years earlier, and just talking about it in this very routine way. And it is just outrageous, yet it's commonplace. It happens every day in prosecutors' offices in America, and it's an outrage.
Yes.
I know very little about this issue, so what I'm asking might be might be an obvious answer to this, but why is the military not an option for prisoners coming out of prison to go that route?
Why is the military not an option?
After conviction, she's referring to why people are not allowed to go into the military.
Can I answer that? Yeah, go ahead,
Let
Valentino.
me answer that.
Go ahead.
On the way in, before we came here, I told Mark that should be an option, right? Because what I noticed, I had the discipline to draw for 10 hours a day, but a lot of guys didn't have the discipline in there, you know, and they slept most of the time or just went to the prison yard and wasted the rest of the day, you know. And if you had that military presence or the option to start training while you were in there, you know, I know that the military, from what I see, I've never been there, but from what I see, it instills a lot of discipline. You know, it teaches a young man how to be a man. So that definitely would be a good solution to some point.
There has been a resistance for a long time in our society to having people with convictions go into the military at all, right? And so we'd have to revisit that to I think to achieve that. And then there are certain people who may. I mean, Valentino's a great guy, but I think he's too old now. I think they wouldn't even take him.
I'm in good shape, though.
I'm sure you are. Exactly. You look great. So listen. So we are out of time, but let me make the following. We're all here. If you have questions or thoughts or suggestions, we'll stay at least until we get too hungry to stay. So come up and chat with us. I really want to thank my three co-panelists today. They've been totally fabulous. So thank you.
I can talk loud enough.
I know that.
He knows that for sure.
He used to be my rabbi.
That's right. So Rennie Wolfson and Bruce Turnbull are the co-chairs of our criminal justice task force and an initiative. And I'd like to ask them to just say a few words about what we as JCPA are doing and what we want to see, hopefully, all of us in CRCs around the country doing.
Thank you, Neil, and thank all of you for an extraordinary program. And for Melanie and Roy, the criminal justice programming this last couple of days has been extraordinary. You guys are great impresarios. Thank you so much. So I'm speaking on behalf of my partner, Bruce. Bruce does things like he represents us at the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition and the Criminal Justice Task Force of the leadership leadership conference. I can't read my own writing on civil rights, and the Justice Roundtable. I just ask for money, but that's what I'm good at. So I want to talk to you for a moment. First of all, to urge you to participate in this great project in your communities. Every community in JCPA needs to be involved in criminal justice. Let me tell you how it checks off all the boxes. It's community relations. Through this, we will collaborate with all kinds of other organizations, social justice organizations, social service organizations, faith organizations, including our own congregations in our towns, the Bar Association, legislative groups. It's a wonderful community relations opportunity, as well as doing some wonderful things for the country we live in and for the people who are in need. So please participate. The other thing I want to tell you is, first of all, we have some great news. We have been blessed by funding for this because we got to pay for this program. We got to pay Roy's salary. Roy, can you wait until Thursday to cash your check? Things are a little slow this week. But we've had some great help. The David Rockefeller Foundation has stepped up for us. The UJA of New York, thank you. The UJA of New York is funding a pilot project, so that we can do this in New York City. And most importantly, the Toby and Leon Cooperman Family Foundation has given us a very generous matching grant. But we have to match it. And that's what we need your help with. So on the one hand, if you contribute to this project or to JCPA, because we need your help as well, and you have stuff in your tables, leaflets on your tables about this, that would be great. What would also be wonderful is in your communities the foundations at your federations, local foundations that would contribute to meaningful social justice programs. Connect us with them. We need their help. They want to participate in a program like this that has some meaningful results, and your help to connect us with them does them a favor because they want to accomplish this goal along with us. Two other things before I get down. One is that I noticed that Payne the Poet has a website, and it could be that he'll let us download. Well, yeah, but I mean, if it's on there and it's in the public domain and you can download it, show it to your CRC. For crying out loud, show it to your Federation board. They need to see it, and it's a great way for them to understand what you're doing. The second thing is, I think the most powerful thing I heard this morning, and we heard some really powerful stuff, was that the indignation that the Jewish community has when they see anti-Semitism in the black community is so disproportionate to the indignation they have over injustice in the African American community. This is the way we can close that gap just a little bit. So help us financially, participate in the project, and we'll be very grateful. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to spend 1 second. Also on your tables is a flyer about a civil rights mission at the end of April. And as was mentioned, criminal justice reform is the civil rights struggle of today. But we also have a history, and the Jewish community has a very proud history, and some not so proud. And this is a mission where people can come and learn about the civil rights of the 60s. And I think maybe we can spend the time, those of us who are there, talking about the civil rights mission of this generation and criminal justice reform and what we're doing. So I encourage you all to come on the mission.
Thank you all. Thank you. And again, I really want to thank our panel for really highlighting some of the important issues. There's a wonderful teaching in Pirkei Avot from the Talmud, in the name of a rabbi who lived 1,800 years ago, Rabbi Tarfon, who said, "The time is short and the task of redeeming the world is great, and even if it's not ours to see its completion, nonetheless we're obligated to work toward it." And each of you is doing that. And I'm so glad that you're sitting here, and I hope I can get a chance to talk to you and get to know you. And may God bless you as you go forth on the rest of your life's journey.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News, and for the last 15 years I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one could ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, less than 1/1% of Mox News viewers ever donate, tip, or contribute anything back. Again, let me make that really clear. Much less than 1/110 of 1% ever give anything back. And to those of you who have donated to Mox News, I want to thank you so much, because it's because of your generosity that we have been able to bring attention to important videos that millions and millions of eyes would have never seen. And I think that that's an amazing thing that we've been able to make happen together. And I can't thank you enough for helping me make that happen. So it's not too late. If you'd like to see Mox News covering the 2020 presidential election, if you can't imagine the 2020 presidential election without Mox News, please, there's still time. You can make a difference. It's easy to make a contribution, donation, or tip. You can go to moxnews.com, or in the text body of this video, there are clickable links to the Patreon page or to the PayPal page. And again, it should take less than 2 minutes to make a donation, and your donation can make a big difference. So I thank you all. Stay cool. One of these days this war is going to end, and it would be awesome if Mox News could be there to celebrate that day with you.